Live scent did not stop at the Wells property. It didn't fade into the woods. It didn't vanish in chaos. It led deliberately onto neighboring land, onto a driveway, and onto barefoot child-sized footprints that appeared after heavy rain. This case may not hinge on where Summer Wells disappeared, but on where she was tracked alive, days later, under active search conditions. If these scent alerts and footprints are authentic, then the timeline collapses. The wandered off narrative fractures, and the investigation may have overlooked a moving child, not a lost one. The most consequential evidence in the Summer Wells case is not dramatic, not visual, and not widely discussed. It is procedural. It is environmental. And by standard investigative logic, it should not exist at all. Live scent alerts appearing on neighboring properties. Barefoot, child-sized footprints identified as fresh, and all of it emerging after a heavy rainfall that should have erased any meaningful trace of earlier movement. Taken together, these elements form a cluster of data that directly challenges the earliest assumptions of the case. According to multiple accounts tied to search operations, trained live scent dogs tracked Summer Wells, sent beyond the Wells property and onto neighboring land. This alone is notable. In missing child investigations, scent commonly disperses outward from a last-seen location, weakens with distance, and becomes chaotic in wooded or uneven terrain. Here, however, the reported tracking was not diffuse. The scent was followed with enough continuity to prompt focused searches on specific neighboring properties. That implies not a vague environmental presence, but a trace strong enough to guide canine behavior with purpose. Even more significant is where this scent was reportedly detected, not merely along transitional paths or natural corridors, but on driveways and within residential land not belonging to the Wells family. This detail matters because it reframes the context of movement. A scent on a driveway is not incidental. It is not a place a lost child would likely wander aimlessly, nor a surface that easily retains scent over time. It is a human-controlled space, typically compacted, trafficked, and exposed. For a live scent dog to alert there suggests proximity in time and a relatively intact scent signature. This brings the analysis directly to the issue of rainfall. In the 24 hours preceding Summer's disappearance, the area reportedly received approximately 0.75 to 0.78 inches of rain. This was not a light drizzle. By local standards, it qualifies as a substantial downpour. From a forensic perspective, this matters for two reasons: scent degradation and footprint formation. Rain is one of the most effective natural disruptors of scent. It breaks down skin cell deposits, disperses airborne particles, and accelerates the dissipation of odor on artificial surfaces such as gravel, concrete, or packed dirt. While it is true that scent can sometimes persist under certain conditions, particularly in shaded, undisturbed natural terrain, heavy rain significantly reduces the likelihood that an older scent trail remains coherent enough to be followed days later, especially across mixed surfaces. At the same time, rain creates conditions that preserve footprints rather than erase them. Moist soil records impressions more clearly than dry ground. Investigators trained in tracking and search operations often use rainfall as a temporal marker. Footprints formed after rain have sharper edges, clearer contours, and less erosion than those formed before. This distinction is critical when determining whether a print is recent or historical. In this case, neighbors reported the discovery of barefoot, child-sized footprints on their property, with deputies allegedly confirming that the prints were fresh and consistent with a child of Summer's size. More importantly, live scent dogs reportedly alerted to Summer's scent in association with at least one of these footprints. That combination, fresh footprint plus scent alert, fundamentally alters the timeline. If the footprints were made after the rainfall, then they cannot predate the storm. If the scent was present on or near those footprints after the rain, then it is unlikely to be residual from days earlier. This directly undermines the explanation that canines were merely following an old trail from routine wandering prior to June 15. The environmental conditions argue against that interpretation. Investigators reportedly asked neighbors for the shoe sizes of their children, a standard exclusionary step. According to the accounts, deputies indicated that the footprint did not match those children, and that it was barefoot. This detail is subtle but important. A barefoot print suggests immediacy, vulnerability, and a lack of deliberate travel preparation. It also aligns with known descriptions of summer frequently being barefoot in outdoor settings. While this does not constitute definitive identification, it strengthens the relevance of the footprint as potential evidence rather than random noise. The presence of adult footprints in the same areas does not negate this finding. Search operations necessarily contaminate terrain. Once an area has been saturated with searchers, it becomes difficult to determine whether adult footprints accompanied a child or simply overlaid the scene afterward. What matters is that the child-sized footprint was recognized as distinct and significant enough to trigger intensified search activity, including repeated ground searches and aerial support. From an investigative standpoint, the convergence of these factors, fresh footprints, live scent alerts, and post-rain conditions, forces a reconsideration of the core timeline. If summer's scent and physical trace appear in places they should not appear after environmental cleansing, then one of two things must be true. Either the evidence has been misinterpreted at multiple levels, or summer was physically present in those locations after the rainfall event. This does not require an accusation. It does not require assigning intent or agency. It simply requires acknowledging movement. Movement after the point at which the public narrative assumes disappearance. That distinction matters. A child who vanishes from a single location presents one type of investigative challenge. A child who moves, whether independently or with assistance, presents another entirely. What makes this evidence especially troubling is not just what it suggests, but what it disrupts. Early assumptions about a child wandering off into the woods rely on predictable patterns, dispersing scent, random directionality, and eventual discovery within a search radius. The evidence described here does not follow that pattern. Instead, it points to directed movement, specific locations, and temporal proximity. If summer wells left detectable scent and footprints on neighboring properties after heavy rain, then the investigation may have been anchored to an incorrect temporal frame. The question shifts from, "Where did she go?" to, "When was she last moving?" That shift has consequences. It affects how search areas are prioritized, how witness statements are evaluated, and how gaps in supervision are interpreted. The investigative value of this evidence lies precisely in its discomfort. It resists easy categorization. It does not fit neatly into accident, abduction, or simple wandering narratives. But it is grounded in physical indicators that are difficult to dismiss without explanation. Rain, scent, and footprints are not subjective. They obey environmental rules. When those rules are violated, investigators are obligated to ask why. This evidence should not exist if the accepted timeline is correct. Yet it does. And until it is addressed directly, the case remains defined not by what is known, but by what has been set aside. The path traced by live scent dogs in the Summer Wells case does not resemble the trajectory investigators expect when a child wanders away into wilderness. According to multiple reported accounts, the scent trail did not fragment into the surrounding terrain, nor did it diffuse randomly across wooded ground. Instead, it followed a coherent route from the hill near the Wells' home, down the driveway, along a dog trail, and ultimately to the road where it stopped. This pattern is not merely unusual. It is structurally inconsistent with a simple, lost in the woods scenario. Several sources have independently described the same endpoint. Dave Ryder of EcuSearch has stated that he heard the live scent track, took the scent to the end of the driveway, and then to the road, where it was lost. Ronnie Lawson of Hawkins County has similarly indicated that the scent ended at the road. Other individuals involved in or briefed on the search have echoed this conclusion. While the exact timing of the track and the number of dogs involved are not publicly documented in full detail, the convergence on a single termination point is notable. In forensic analysis, consistency across independent accounts is often more informative than precision in any one of them. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to distinguish between two concepts that are frequently conflated in public discussion: scent loss and scent termination. Scent loss occurs when a dog can no longer detect a usable odor due to environmental interference, wind, rain, terrain changes, or contamination by other human activity. It is typically gradual and chaotic. The dog may circle, cast back and forth, or abandon the trail in an area with no obvious boundary. Termination, by contrast, is abrupt. The dog follows a coherent track to a specific location and then stops because the scent does not continue beyond that point. Reports in this case describe the latter, not the former. The scent did not fade into the woods or dissolve across open ground. It led to a defined surface, the roadway, and ended there. That distinction is critical because roads function as scent disruptors in predictable ways. They are hard surfaces, frequently traveled, exposed to heat and airflow, and often act as boundaries where scent carried on foot ceases to be detectable. When a live scent trail ends at a road, investigators are trained to consider certain possibilities, not as conclusions, but as patterns observed across many cases. One such pattern is vehicle interaction. This does not mean a crime occurred, nor does it specify who might be involved. It simply reflects the reality that a person who transitions from walking to riding in a vehicle often leaves a trail that ends at a roadway. The dog follows the person to the point of entry, and the scent does not continue on the road because the individual is no longer moving on foot. Importantly, this is a probabilistic inference, not proof. Roads can also represent boundaries where scent is overwhelmed by traffic or environmental factors. However, the inference becomes stronger when the termination is clean and when other expected indicators of wilderness wandering are absent. Those expected indicators are notably missing here. If Summer had wandered into the surrounding woods, the scent would likely have behaved differently. Children who move through wooded terrain leave irregular scent patterns. They stop, turn, backtrack, or change direction. Their scent disperses along animal paths, creeks, and uneven ground. Dogs tracking such movement often exhibit confusion or branching behavior, especially when terrain is dense. A clean progression from home to driveway to trail to road does not align with that behavioral profile. The absence of cadaver dog alerts on the Wells property further complicates the picture. According to reported statements, cadaver dogs were deployed and did not alert on the home, vehicles, or immediate surroundings. This does not rule out harm occurring elsewhere, nor does it prove anything about timing. But it does undermine the assumption that Summer met her fate at or near the house. If the child had died there or been transported in a vehicle that remained on the property, cadaver dogs would be expected, though not guaranteed, to show interest. Their lack of alerts removes one explanation while leaving others unresolved. This contrast between live scent tracking and cadaver dog results is often misunderstood. Live scent dogs are trained to follow the odor of a living person, typically using a scent article. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect the specific chemical compounds associated with human decomposition. The two are complementary but not interchangeable. In cases where a live scent trail is strong and cadaver dogs show no interest at the origin point, investigators are faced with a narrow question: where did the transition occur, and what kind of transition was it? Here, the transition point appears to be the road. That raises a structured forensic question rather than a speculative one. What event causes a live scent trail to end precisely at a roadway? There are limited answers. Environmental washout is one, but it usually produces diffusion rather than abrupt termination, especially when the trail leading to the road is intact. Contamination by other people is another, but that typically creates confusion earlier in the track, not a clean endpoint. The remaining explanations involve a change in how the person is moving, most commonly, from walking to riding. It is important to emphasize what this does not say. It does not identify a perpetrator. It does not confirm abduction. It does not establish criminal intent. It does not even require that Summer was taken against her will. Children sometimes enter vehicles voluntarily, whether familiar or unfamiliar. The evidence, as reported, does not speak to motive or agency. It speaks only to movement and interruption. Critically, this interpretation also intersects with the timeline established in Part 1. The area experienced significant rainfall before the search activity described. Rain tends to degrade older scent trails, particularly on hard surfaces like driveways and roads. If the dogs were following an old trail from days earlier, It would be expected to be weakest precisely where it was reportedly strongest, on the driveway and up to the road. Instead, the track was coherent enough to be followed to a distinct endpoint. That coherence suggests temporal proximity, not historical residue. Investigators are trained to be cautious with K9 evidence, and rightly so. Dogs are tools, not witnesses. Their alerts require contextual validation. But dismissing a consistent termination point without explanation carries its own risk. In this case, the termination is not an isolated claim. It is repeated across accounts and aligns with the physical logic of scent behavior. Ignoring it does not make it disappear. It simply leaves a gap in the narrative. That gap has consequences. If the working assumption is that Summer wandered into the woods and was lost, resources are directed toward expansive terrain searches, water features, and natural hazards. If the scent instead indicates a transition at the road, the investigative lens shifts. Attention turns to timing, traffic patterns, witness statements along roadways, and potential vehicle movements. These are not interchangeable approaches. Choosing the wrong one can stall an investigation without any overt error being made. The fact that the scent did not lead into the woods, but stopped at the road does not solve the case. What it does is narrow the field of plausible explanations. It challenges the idea that Summer simply disappeared into the environment. It suggests an interaction, brief or extended, benign or harmful, that altered her mode of movement. And it demands an answer to a question that has never been publicly addressed in a systematic way. Why did the scent end there? Until that question is confronted directly, the scent trail remains one of the most underexamined elements of the case. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is precise. And in forensic investigation, precision is rarely accidental. Among the physical traces discussed in the Summer Wells case, none are more quietly disruptive to the prevailing narratives than the reported footprints found on neighboring land, and, more importantly, on elevated ridge terrain. These footprints are often mentioned in passing, folded into broader conversations about scent trails or search efforts. What is rarely examined is the defining characteristic that makes them anomalous: elevation. The issue is not how far these prints were from Summer's home. It is why they were higher. According to multiple accounts, barefoot, child-sized footprints were discovered on land adjacent to the Wells property and further up on a ridge behind neighboring residences. These discoveries were reportedly acknowledged by deputies on scene, discussed with property owners, and followed by intensified search activity, including repeat ground searches and aerial support. The neighbors who reported the findings described law enforcement asking for shoe sizes of their children, a standard exclusionary procedure, and indicating that the prints were fresh and consistent with a child. While official documentation has not been released publicly, the convergence of neighbor testimony and observed search response lends weight to the claim that the footprints were treated as operationally significant at the time. What has been largely absent from public analysis is a serious discussion of terrain. Ridges in this region are not gentle inclines. They are uneven, wooded, and physically demanding even for adults. The elevation gain is abrupt in places, with dense brush, limited visibility, and no clear incentive for casual ascent. For a barefoot 5-year-old to move uphill into such terrain is not impossible. But it is behaviorally atypical, especially when considered alongside known patterns of lost children. Search and rescue literature consistently notes that young children who wander tend to move along paths of least resistance. They follow trails, roads, streams, or downhill gradients. They are drawn toward open areas, water, or familiar landmarks. Ascending into higher, more difficult terrain runs counter to these tendencies. When children do move uphill, it is often in response to a specific stimulus, following another person, seeking a vantage point, or being guided. Random wandering rarely produces deliberate elevation gain. This is where the distinction between distance and elevation becomes critical. Distance can be misleading. A footprint a mile away may sound dramatic, but it does not inherently indicate intent or assistance. Elevation, by contrast, implies effort. Climbing requires energy, balance, and purpose. It slows movement and increases fatigue, particularly for a barefoot child. Investigators trained in behavioral analysis recognize that uphill travel is a decision point. It suggests either motivation or direction, not confusion. The reported footprints on the ridge, therefore, introduce a behavioral contradiction. If Summer was lost, frightened, or aimlessly wandering, the ridge is an unlikely destination. It offers no obvious shelter, no water source, and no familiar reference points. It does not lead back toward home. It does not simplify movement. It complicates it. The direction alone challenges the assumption of a disoriented child moving without guidance. Terrain difficulty compounds this issue. Accounts from searchers describe steep slopes, thick underbrush, and hazardous conditions, including wildlife and heat. These are not environments a barefoot child would easily or instinctively navigate. The absence of reported injuries or additional signs, torn clothing, blood, or widespread disturbance further complicates the picture. A child climbing such terrain alone would be expected to leave more than a single set of prints. Scrapes, falls, broken vegetation, or repeated impressions would be likely. Yet the focus remains on discrete footprints, not a chaotic trail. One explanation sometimes offered is that the child may have been familiar with the area and therefore comfortable moving through it. Familiarity can account for some behaviors, but it does not eliminate the elevation problem. Familiar children still prefer easier routes. Comfort does not negate gravity. Moreover, familiarity does not explain why the movement was away from home and upward, rather than along known loops, roads, or play areas described by family and neighbors. Another explanation suggests that the footprints may not be temporally connected to the disappearance. This returns the analysis to environmental context. As discussed previously, the area experienced significant rainfall prior to the discovery of the prints. Rain both degrades old footprints and enhances the clarity of new ones. If the prints were fresh, as deputies reportedly indicated, then they post-date the rain event. That timing reduces the likelihood that they were residual artifacts from unrelated play days earlier. It places them within the active search window, when movement should have been increasingly difficult without detection. This leads to a more uncomfortable question: what circumstances would lead a child to ascend a ridge during an active search period? The answer does not require speculation about wrongdoing. It requires acknowledging that certain movements are unlikely to occur spontaneously. A child does not typically climb into more difficult terrain when disoriented or afraid. They seek familiarity, not isolation. They seek down, not up. The ridge footprints also intersect with the scent evidence in a meaningful way. Live scent alerts reportedly occurred in proximity to some of these footprint locations. Scent and footprint together are more informative than either alone. Scent indicates presence, footprints indicate physical contact with the ground. When both align on elevated terrain, the implication is not simply that Summer was there, but that she arrived there under conditions that allowed her scent to remain detectable. That again suggests temporal proximity and purposeful movement. It is important to stress that purposeful movement does not equal voluntary movement. Children follow. They are guided. They respond to instruction. The evidence does not tell us why Summer moved uphill, only that the movement is inconsistent with random wandering. This inconsistency is the investigative value. It identifies a behavioral red flag that demands explanation. Too often, discussions of the case collapse complexity into distance metrics. How many miles, how many acres, how large the search area. These metrics obscure more than they reveal. A child can travel far along a road without assistance. A child climbing a ridge barefoot is a different scenario entirely. The latter requires either unusual motivation or external influence. By shifting the analysis from how far to why up, the ridge footprints force a reassessment of assumptions that have guided public understanding of the case. They suggest that the movement pattern does not align with a lost child narrative. They do not prove an alternative. They simply indicate that the existing explanation does not adequately account for the evidence. From an investigative standpoint, this matters because behavioral anomalies often precede breakthroughs. They identify points where standard explanations fail. The ridge footprints are such a point. They do not resolve the case, but they narrow the field of plausible interpretations and highlight where further scrutiny should be applied. If Summer's footprints were found on a ridge after rainfall, verified by neighbors and treated seriously enough to prompt repeated searches, then the question is not whether she could have wandered there. The question is why she would have. Until that question is addressed directly, the elevation problem remains one of the most underexamined and potentially revealing elements of the case. In cases dominated by family narratives, law enforcement silence, and online speculation, third-party testimony is often the first element dismissed. Neighbors are framed as unreliable, mistaken, or motivated by attention. Yet in the Summer Wells investigation, the accounts provided by adjacent property owners, particularly those associated with the Phillips property, and nearby land deserve closer examination precisely because they resist those dismissals. When evaluated for timing, consistency, and corroboration with physical evidence, these statements align more closely with documented search behavior than with rumor. The core testimonies in question were made contemporaneously, during or shortly after active search operations. They were not retrospective theories offered years later. Neighbors described law enforcement presence, canine activity, and specific procedural steps taken on their properties. Some of these statements were later deleted from public platforms, but copies were archived by viewers and researchers. The deletions themselves do not invalidate the content. If anything, they reflect the volatile environment surrounding the case, where neighbors faced intense scrutiny, online harassment, and pressure to withdraw from public discussion. What distinguishes these accounts is not their dramatic quality, but their operational detail. Multiple neighbors independently stated that they allowed full searches of their properties. This included permission to search yards, wooded areas, outbuildings, vehicles, and in some cases interiors of structures. Such access is not automatic. Law enforcement typically requests consent or obtains warrants only when there is a reason to believe a location may be relevant. The willingness of neighbors to grant access and the reported acceptance of that access by deputies suggests the searches were not perfunctory or symbolic. Several neighbors also described deputies asking for the shoe sizes of their children. This detail appears repeatedly across accounts and is significant because it reflects a standard exclusionary practice. When investigators encounter a footprint believed to be relevant, they seek to rule out innocent explanations before escalating. Asking for shoe sizes is a practical step designed to determine whether the print could belong to a resident child. According to these testimonies, deputies indicated that the footprint did not match the sizes provided, and that it was barefoot. The repetition of this procedural detail across independent statements strengthens its credibility. The reported confirmation of freshness is another critical point. Neighbors stated that deputies described the footprints as fresh, a conclusion presumably informed by soil condition, edge definition, and recent weather. While the exact criteria used were not disclosed, the timing aligns with known rainfall in the area. Fresh prints appearing after rain are more legible and more likely to draw investigative attention. The fact that search efforts reportedly intensified following these findings, rather than concluding, supports the notion that law enforcement considered them meaningful. Consistency is the primary analytical lens here. Across multiple statements, neighbors described similar sequences: discovery or observation of footprints, K9 alerts in proximity, deputies engaging in exclusionary checks, and subsequent expansion of search activity. Minor variations in phrasing or emphasis are expected and do not undermine the core alignment. In investigative analysis, perfect uniformity is often a red flag. Natural consistency with minor divergence is more indicative of independent recollection. Equally important is the apparent lack of incentive to fabricate. These neighbors did not gain materially or reputationally from their involvement. On the contrary, public association with a high-profile missing child case often brings unwanted attention, suspicion, and harassment. Several individuals withdrew from public commentary altogether. There is no clear benefit to inventing details about law enforcement actions that could be easily contradicted by authorities if false. The risk profile favors silence, not embellishment. The content of these testimonies also aligns with the known behavior of K9 teams and search operations. Live scent dogs alerting in specific locations would logically prompt localized searches and verification steps. The described actions, asking shoe sizes, conducting property sweeps, returning with additional personnel, are consistent with standard procedures when potential evidence is encountered. Nothing in these accounts requires extraordinary assumptions about investigative conduct. They describe routine responses to non-routine findings. Terrain data further supports the credibility of the neighbors' statements. The areas described: yards leading into wooded ridges, uneven ground, mixed surfaces match locations where both scent and footprints would be evaluated carefully. Canine alerts in such environments are not random. Handlers interpret them in context, considering wind, slope, and surface. The neighbors' descriptions of where dogs worked and where deputies focused attention correspond with areas later discussed in relation to elevation and movement, reinforcing continuity across different strands of evidence. A common critique is that neighbors may have misunderstood what they observed, particularly regarding the type of dogs involved. Confusion between live scent and cadaver dogs is frequent among lay observers. However, even when this possibility is acknowledged, it does not nullify the core claims. Whether the dogs were live scent or cadaver, deputies' follow-up actions, exclusionary checks, expanded searches, and repeated returns indicate that the alerts were taken seriously at the time. The operational response, not the terminology, is the evidentiary anchor. Another critique is that deleted statements should be treated with skepticism. In isolation, that caution is reasonable. In context, it is less persuasive. Deletions occurred amid escalating online hostility and speculation. Archival copies show that the statements were not retroactively altered, they were removed. Moreover, the archived content has been cross-referenced by multiple researchers, reducing the risk of selective quotation. The substance of the statements remains consistent across different captures. From an investigative standpoint, the value of this testimony lies in its corroborative function. It does not introduce a new theory. It corroborates action searches conducted, procedures followed that align with physical evidence discussed elsewhere: scent termination, fresh footprints, and terrain-based anomalies. This is not rumor amplification. It is third-party confirmation that law enforcement behavior matched what would be expected if those anomalies were real. In many cases, the most reliable witnesses are those who are not central to the event and have no stake in its outcome. The neighbors in question fit that profile. They were not responsible for supervision, not related to the family, and not publicly advocating a narrative. They described what happened on their land, when it happened, and how authorities responded. Their accounts do not attempt to explain why events occurred, only that they did. The investigative implication is straightforward. When third-party testimony independently aligns with canine behavior, environmental conditions, and observed search responses, it warrants inclusion in serious analysis. It does not resolve ambiguity, but it narrows the range of plausible explanations. It also challenges the notion that all non-official information in this case is speculative or unreliable. Ultimately, the neighbor testimony holds up because it is mundane. It lacks sensationalism. It focuses on procedure rather than interpretation. And it intersects with physical evidence in ways that are difficult to dismiss without offering an alternative explanation for the documented law enforcement actions. In a case where official silence has left gaps, this type of corroborative, third-party evidence becomes especially valuable not as proof, but as context grounded in observed reality rather than conjecture. Few elements in the Summer Wells investigation have generated as much confusion and as little clarity as the statements attributed to Fred Hill regarding canine activity on his driveway. The confusion is not incidental. It sits at the intersection of terminology, proximity, and inference, and it has allowed a consequential data point to be diluted by argument over labels rather than examined for what it implies. When stripped of mischaracterization, the issue is straightforward: dogs reportedly tracked onto a neighbor's driveway. The dispute is not whether this occurred, but what type of dogs were involved and what that distinction actually changes. Fred Hill has stated that dogs worked his driveway during search operations. In some retellings, he referred to these dogs as cadaver dogs. In others, the implication was live scent tracking. Critics have seized on this inconsistency as grounds to dismiss the entire claim. That approach mistakes imprecision for falsity. Lay witnesses frequently mislabel specialized tools. In search operations, the distinction between cadaver and live scent dogs is technical, not intuitive. What matters is not the term used by a neighbor, but the operational response that followed. If cadaver dogs had alerted on Fred Hill's driveway, the investigative consequences would have been immediate and substantial. Cadaver alerts trigger preservation, forensic excavation, and often extended scene control. No such recovery has been publicly documented at that location. There is no record of remains found on the driveway, no reported forensic excavation, and no subsequent confirmation of human decomposition evidence. On that basis alone, a cadaver dog interpretation appears weak. It conflicts with the absence of recovery and with the known deployment patterns described elsewhere in the case. That leaves the more plausible interpretation: live scent tracking. This aligns with other reported data points: live scent dogs tracking from the Wells property to the road, alerts associated with footprints, and focused searches on neighboring land. If live scent dogs worked Fred Hill's driveway, the question shifts from outcome to presence. Why would Summers' live scent be there? The proximity of Fred Hill's property to other areas of interest compounds this question. His driveway sits within a cluster of neighboring lands that were searched repeatedly. It is also geographically connected, through roadways and terrain, to the Van Hill area and the Paul Hill property, which later became the subject of a search warrant. While proximity alone proves nothing, it provides context. Movement across adjacent properties is not random when terrain funnels travel along specific paths, driveways, ridgelines, and access roads. The mislabeling of dog types has obscured a more important point. Regardless of whether the dogs were cadaver or live scent, their presence on a neighbor's driveway places Summers' trace off the Wells property. If cadaver dogs had alerted, the implication would be that remains were once present there, even if later moved. If live scent dogs alerted, the implication would be that Summer was physically present on that driveway while alive, at some point relevant to the search. These are different scenarios, but they converge on the same conclusion: movement beyond the original property boundary. Critically, neither interpretation supports a closed-loop narrative in which Summer wandered briefly and vanished into nearby woods. Both require engagement with neighboring land and transitional spaces. This is why the debate over dog type, while understandable, is ultimately secondary. It distracts from the consistency of off-property indicators. The live scent interpretation is also more consistent with the broader evidentiary pattern. Live scent dogs reportedly tracked to the road and stopped. Footprints were found on neighboring land and at elevation. Searches expanded outward rather than inward. These elements fit together coherently if Summer moved across properties and through human-defined corridors. A live scent alert on a driveway fits that pattern. A cadaver alert, by contrast, would introduce a different set of expectations that were not met. It is also important to consider how information flows during active searches. Neighbors observe dogs working an area. They see handlers confer with deputies. They watch searches intensify or dissipate. They do not receive technical briefings on dog specialization. When a neighbor later recounts events, they may use the most familiar term available. That imprecision should prompt clarification, not dismissal. From an analytical perspective, the absence of recovery at Fred Hill's driveway does not invalidate the claim that dogs worked there. It refines the interpretation. If no remains were found, then the most conservative reading is that live scent dogs detected presence without death at that location. That places Summer alive on neighbor land at some point. It does not specify duration, cause, or outcome. It specifies presence. This presence raises a question that has not been adequately addressed: what mechanism brought Summer to that driveway? The driveway is not a natural destination. It is not a play area, a water source, or a shelter. It is a conduit. Driveways connect properties to roads. They facilitate movement, not lingering. A live scent alert there suggests transition, passing through, not stopping. The investigative value of this point lies in its neutrality. It does not accuse. It does not speculate on intent. It simply recognizes that certain locations function differently in movement analysis. When a scent appears on a driveway, investigators ask how and why, not who. The focus is on pathways and timing. By reframing the Fred Hill discussion away from terminology disputes and toward movement logic, the evidence becomes more coherent. The confusion over dogs has acted as noise, allowing a consistent theme to be overlooked. Multiple indicators place Summer off the Wells property in transitional spaces, under conditions inconsistent with random wandering. Whether one accepts the live scent interpretation outright or remains agnostic, the conclusion remains the same. The data do not support a static disappearance confined to the original property. They support movement across boundaries, movement that intersects with neighbors' land and infrastructure. In investigative work, convergence matters more than certainty. When different lines of evidence scent trails, footprints, neighbor testimony point in the same direction, they warrant integration rather than compartmentalization. The Fred Hill driveway is one such convergence point. It does not answer the case, but it reinforces a pattern that persists regardless of how the dogs are labeled. That pattern is simple and difficult to ignore. Summer Wells' trace did not remain where she was last seen. It moved. One of the most persistent attempts to neutralize the scent and footprint evidence in the Summer Wells case is the claim that investigators and K9 teams were merely following an old trail residual movement from days earlier, unrelated to the disappearance itself. On its surface, this explanation sounds reasonable. Children wander. Scents can linger. Footprints can be misleading. But when the environmental conditions are examined carefully, the old trail argument weakens to the point of implausibility. The critical variable is rain. In the period immediately preceding the discovery of key scent alerts and footprints, the area experienced a significant rainfall event estimated at approximately 0.75 to 0.78 inches. This was not a light or scattered shower. It was enough to saturate soil, alter ground texture, and materially affect both scent persistence and footprint formation. In environmental forensics, rain is not a background detail. It is a filter that separates old evidence from new. Dog handlers consistently explain scent behavior in terms of degradation rather than permanence. Human scent is composed primarily of skin cells and associated bacteria, which shed continuously and settle on surfaces. Over time, these particles disperse, break down, and are redistributed by wind, heat, and moisture. Rain accelerates this process. On hard or compacted surfaces, driveways, roads, packed dirt, rain rapidly reduces the scent concentration. On natural surfaces, it pushes scent deeper into soil or washes it downslope, fragmenting coherent trails. This is why the timing of scent detection matters. An old trail that predates a heavy rain event is expected to be weaker, less continuous, and more difficult for dogs to follow, especially across mixed terrain. Dogs encountering such trails typically exhibit casting behavior, confusion, or partial tracking that fades unpredictably. What they do not usually do is follow a coherent path to a precise endpoint. In this case, however, live scent dogs reportedly tracked a continuous route from the hill near the Wells home, down the driveway, along a dog trail, and to the road where the scent terminated. This occurred after rainfall sufficient to disrupt older scent. The coherence of the track under these conditions argues against the idea that it was merely a remnant from casual wandering days earlier. Rain affects footprints differently. While it degrades scent, it enhances the visibility and preservation of fresh impressions. Wet soil records detail, edges are sharper, pressure points are clearer. Conversely, older footprints tend to soften, erode, or collapse entirely after heavy rain. This dual-effect scent degradation, combined with footprint enhancement, is central to understanding why the environmental context here is so informative. Reports indicate that barefoot, child-sized footprints were identified on neighboring land after the rain. Deputies reportedly described them as fresh. That assessment would not have been made lightly. Freshness is evaluated by examining edge integrity, sediment displacement, and the relationship between the print and surrounding ground disturbance. In wet conditions, a fresh print stands out. An old one does not. When fresh footprints appear after rain and are associated with live scent alerts, the timing window narrows dramatically. The evidence is no longer compatible with a broad, undefined timeline in which a child might have wandered days earlier. Instead, it points to movement that occurred after the rain event. That is not a speculative leap. It is an inference grounded in environmental behavior. Proponents of the old trail theory often argue that scent can last for days, even weeks, under the right conditions. That is technically true in controlled or favorable environments. It is far less true in open, mixed terrain subject to weather. More importantly, the question is not whether scent can persist, but whether it can persist in a form coherent enough to guide a dog to a road endpoint after significant rainfall. The available evidence suggests that this is unlikely. The same logic applies to footprints. A barefoot child playing days earlier might leave impressions, but rain of the magnitude reported would be expected to degrade those prints substantially. The emergence of clear, identifiable prints after rain is inconsistent with that scenario. The environmental record favors recency, not antiquity. This is where environmental forensics offers an advantage often absent in missing child cases. Timelines are usually elastic. Witness statements conflict. Memories fade, but weather is fixed. Rain falls when it falls. Its effects are predictable. When investigators incorporate weather into analysis, they gain a rare opportunity to constrain time rather than expand it. In the Summer Wells case, that constraint is uncomfortable because it challenges early assumptions. If the scent and footprints are post-rain, then they post-date June 15. That reframes the case from one of immediate disappearance to one involving subsequent movement. It suggests that Summer was alive and mobile after the point at which the public narrative assumes she was lost or taken. This does not imply wrongdoing. It does not assign responsibility. It simply acknowledges that the evidence, when filtered through environmental reality, resists the idea of an old, irrelevant trail. That she walked there days earlier explanation fails not because it is impossible, but because it is inconsistent with how rain interacts with scent and soil. Investigators routinely rely on weather to validate or invalidate evidence. Flooding can erase scenes. Snow can preserve them. Rain can either obscure or clarify, depending on timing. In this instance, rain clarifies. It distinguishes between what could have happened before and what must have happened after. The reluctance to accept this narrowing of the timeline is understandable. It complicates the case. It introduces new questions about supervision, movement, and search efficacy. But complexity does not negate evidence. It demands better questions. By recognizing the forensic role of rain, investigators and analysts gain a clearer picture of when certain events could have occurred. That clarity is rare. It reduces the temptation to explain away inconvenient data as historical noise. It focuses attention on a smaller window of time in which meaningful movement occurred. Ultimately, the rain does not answer what happened to Summer Wells. What it does is tell us when certain explanations stop working. It removes the comfort of a vague past and forces engagement with a more precise, more troubling present. In doing so, it transforms scent and footprints from curiosities into constraints, and constraints are where serious investigations begin. In most missing child investigations, the 911 call is treated as a starting point, a marker of when concern crystallized into action. In the Summer Wells case, the call may serve a different function. Rather than clarifying the moment of disappearance, it exposes uncertainty about supervision and time. The phrasing attributed to the call, specifically the idea that the mother returned home and then discovered the child missing, introduces an absence window that has never been publicly resolved. That window matters because it aligns more closely with the physical evidence than with the dominant narrative. Accounts surrounding the call have been inconsistent from the outset. Public summaries suggest that Candace Wells told dispatch she had gone somewhere briefly and returned to find Summer gone. Later explanations framed this as a miscommunication, a short walk to a nearby camper, a momentary absence, or a misunderstanding by the dispatcher. Yet the call itself has not been released, even through public records requests, leaving analysts to work from reported phrasing rather than primary audio. The absence of the call is itself notable. In many cases, 911 recordings are released once initial investigative sensitivity subsides. Here, The continued withholding suggests the call contains details that complicate the timeline. The phrase, "Mother returned home," is not trivial. Dispatchers are trained to summarize information concisely but accurately. If the mother had been inside the home or immediately adjacent, a return would not typically be emphasized. The wording implies a departure of sufficient duration or distance to be meaningful. That implication, whether accurate or not, introduces the concept of an absence window, a period during which Summer may not have been under direct adult supervision. This window is where several strands of evidence converge. Reports from family and neighbors indicate that Summer had a history of wandering. Some accounts describe her leaving the immediate area, following siblings, or moving toward roads. These reports are not uniform, but they recur across sources. When considered alongside a potential supervision gap, they take on new significance. A child who wanders occasionally does not require an abductor to leave the yard unseen. She requires opportunity. The prevailing public narrative has often assumed continuous supervision up to the moment of disappearance. Under that assumption, any departure from the property must involve an external actor entering the space unnoticed. That assumption is fragile. If supervision was intermittent or absent for even a short period, the need for an abduction at the house scenario diminishes. The evidence does not require a stranger to penetrate a busy yard. It requires only that a child inclined to wander was briefly unwatched. This reframing helps reconcile otherwise conflicting data. Live scent dogs reportedly tracked Summer's scent from the property to the road. Footprints were found on neighboring land and elevated terrain. These indicators are difficult to explain if Summer was seized immediately from the yard. They are easier to explain if she left the property on her own during a supervision gap and continued moving afterward. The timing implied by the 911 call supports this possibility. If Candace was away from the immediate area, even briefly, the moment of Summer's departure could precede the moment of alarm by a meaningful margin. That margin does not need to be long. For a 5-year-old, minutes are sufficient to reach a driveway, a trail, or a road, especially in familiar surroundings. Once beyond the property, movement can continue without immediate detection. This does not assign fault. Supervision lapses occur in ordinary households without catastrophic outcomes. What matters here is not blame but alignment between human behavior and physical evidence. The scent trail did not begin at the road, it began at the home and moved outward. That suggests initial independent movement. The absence window provides a plausible mechanism. Critically, this mechanism also explains why no signs of struggle were reported at the house. An abduction from yard scenario typically leaves indicators, disturbed ground, witness sightings, vehicle noise, or contradictory accounts. None of these have been substantiated publicly. By contrast, a wandering scenario during a brief absence leaves little trace at the origin point. The trace appears later, where movement intersects with environment, and that is where the evidence appears to be concentrated. The "mother returned home" phrasing also intersects with the question of who else was watching. Accounts indicate that Summer's brothers were present, but occupied. Whether they were tasked with supervision, capable of providing it, or aware of Summer's movements remains unclear. This ambiguity is common in family settings and often goes unexamined, yet in investigative terms it matters. Responsibility diffused among multiple people can result in no one actively monitoring a child's location. When analysts focus solely on narrative statements, what people say happened, they risk overlooking these structural gaps. Statements tend to simplify. They compress time, clarify roles, and resolve ambiguity after the fact. Physical evidence does the opposite. It exposes complexity. In this case, the physical evidence suggests movement over time and space, not an instantaneous vanishing. The wandering reports further support this alignment. Children who wander often follow familiar routes, driveways, paths, roads. They are drawn to movement, noise, or the presence of others. They do not typically hide or remain stationary. This behavioral profile matches the scent and footprint evidence more closely than an abduction scenario constrained to the yard. It also aligns with the absence of cadaver dog alerts at the home. Importantly, this interpretation does not require Summer to have wandered indefinitely. It allows for subsequent interaction, assistance, or intervention elsewhere. The key point is that the initial movement may have been independent. Once that is accepted as a possibility, the investigative focus shifts. Instead of asking how someone could take a child without being seen, the question becomes how far a child could go before anyone noticed, and what happened after. This shift has practical consequences. It suggests that early search efforts may have been anchored too tightly to the assumption of immediate disappearance. It suggests that timelines derived from adult recollection may not align perfectly with child behavior. And it suggests that the most relevant evidence may appear not at the origin point, but along transitional spaces, driveways, trails, roads where independent movement becomes visible. The investigative value of revisiting the 911 call lies in this realignment. The call is not just a record of distress, it is a data point about absence. Without hearing it, analysts cannot resolve its ambiguities. But even the reported phrasing is enough to justify questioning assumptions about supervision. When those assumptions are relaxed, the physical evidence becomes less contradictory. Ultimately, the question is not whether Candace was home or away in a literal sense. It is whether Summer was watched continuously during the critical window. The evidence suggests that this cannot be assumed. When that assumption is removed, a coherent narrative emerges, one in which a wandering child leaves unseen, moves through familiar terrain, and leaves physical traces that are later discovered. By aligning witness behavior imperfect, human, fragmented with environmental and canine evidence, this approach replaces narrative certainty with investigative coherence. It does not solve the case, but it reconciles data that otherwise appear incompatible. And in doing so, it brings the focus back to what the evidence shows, rather than what statements attempt to assert. When the evidence in the Summer Wells case is laid out without hierarchy or narrative preference, a pattern emerges that is both coherent and unsettling. Live scent tracked off the original property. Fresh, barefoot child-sized footprints appearing after rainfall. A scent trail that ends at a road rather than dissolving into wilderness. Footprints found at elevation, not along paths of least resistance, and a conspicuous absence of cadaver dog alerts at the home or immediate surroundings. None of these elements, taken alone, resolve the case. Taken together, they do something else. They describe movement. This distinction is critical. Much of the public discourse surrounding the case has treated evidence as if it were an accusation map, each data point implicitly pointing toward a person, an act, or a moment of harm. That framing is not only premature, it is analytically unhelpful. The evidence does not reliably indicate who was responsible or what ultimately happened. What it does indicate is where Summer Wells appears to have been, and in what sequence. In that sense, this is not an accusation map. It is a movement map. Movement maps answer different questions. They do not ask who did something. They ask how a subject moved through space and time, and what environmental and behavioral constraints shape that movement. In this case, the movement map begins at the Wells property and extends outward. It crosses property lines. It intersects with driveways and roads. It ascends terrain rather than following it downhill. And it leaves traces that are inconsistent with both static disappearance and random loss. The live scent evidence is foundational to this map. Reports consistently place Summer's scent moving away from the home, not fragmenting in confusion, but following a coherent route. This suggests continuity of presence rather than dispersal. The termination of that scent at a roadway is not a conclusion, it is a boundary marker. It indicates a change in conditions. Whether that change involved a vehicle, a pause, or a shift in movement cannot be determined from scent alone. But the boundary itself is real. Fresh footprints reinforce this interpretation. Footprints are not abstract indicators. They are physical records of contact with the ground. When those footprints are described as fresh, barefoot, and child-sized, and when they appear after rainfall that should have erased older impressions, they constrain the timeline. They do not expand it. They tell us that movement occurred within a narrower window than previously assumed. The ridge elevation adds a behavioral dimension. Movement uphill into more difficult terrain is not typical of a lost or frightened child seeking safety. It is effortful, directional, and atypical. It does not fit comfortably within narratives of aimless wandering. At minimum, It suggests that the movement was not purely random. That observation does not require assigning agency. It requires acknowledging deviation from expected behavior. The absence of cadaver dog alerts completes the pattern. Cadaver dogs are not infallible, but they are sensitive to specific chemical signatures. Their lack of alerts at the Wells property or immediate surroundings weakens theories that place death or concealment at the origin point. It does not eliminate the possibility of harm elsewhere. It simply removes one assumption that has anchored much speculation. When these elements are combined, the picture that emerges is not one of sudden vanishing, but of progression. Summer appears to have moved through a series of environments: home, neighboring land, transitional spaces, elevated terrain, leaving different types of evidence at each stage. The case may therefore hinge less on the moment she was last seen and more on the locations she reached afterward. This reframing carries significant investigative implications. If the working assumption was that Summer was lost near the home or immediately abducted from the yard, then early search efforts would naturally concentrate there. Neighboring properties might be searched, but not preserved. Evidence encountered later: footprints, scent alerts might be treated as anomalies rather than anchors. Over time, those anomalies could be sidelined rather than integrated. That raises a series of questions that remain unanswered, not rhetorically, but operationally. Why were neighboring properties not preserved for longer periods once scent and footprint evidence emerged? Preservation does not imply accusation. It is a standard precaution to prevent contamination of potential evidence. If fresh child-sized footprints were identified after rain, preserving the surrounding area could have allowed for more thorough documentation, mapping, and analysis of directionality. Why has the footprint evidence never been formally addressed in public briefings? Footprints are among the most concrete forms of physical evidence in search cases. Even if investigators ultimately discounted their relevance, explaining that decision would provide transparency and reduce speculation. Silence leaves a vacuum that is filled by inference rather than fact. Why has there been no clear, public clarification on scent timing, whether the live scent track occurred on June 15, June 16, or later matters? Environmental conditions changed. Search intensity changed. Witness availability changed. Without clarity on timing, analysts are left to reconcile evidence without a temporal anchor. These questions are not accusations. They do not presume error or misconduct. They recognize that investigations evolve and that early assumptions can constrain later interpretation. Revisiting those assumptions is not a critique. It is a necessary step in any unresolved case. The movement map also suggests that ruling out certain possibilities is as important as confirming others. If Summer was not found because investigators were looking in the wrong places, then conclusively eliminating those places matters. Thoroughly documenting what was searched, when, and why, and how evidence was evaluated can prevent the case from remaining indefinitely suspended between theories. Importantly, none of this requires asserting what happened to Summer Wells. It does not require naming suspects or assigning motives. It requires aligning investigative focus with physical evidence rather than narrative convenience. Physical evidence is indifferent to stories. It reflects interaction with environment, governed by rules of scent, soil, gravity, and behavior. In unresolved cases, there is a tendency to gravitate toward the most emotionally compelling explanation. That tendency is understandable, but it can obscure quieter data points that do not fit neatly. The evidence discussed here is quiet. It does not announce itself. It requires synthesis rather than selection. If Summer was not found because she was not where investigators believed she was, then the most responsible course is to confront that possibility directly. That does not diminish the search. It honors it by ensuring that effort aligns with evidence. Discovery is not the only measure of progress. Ruling out paths, locations, and timelines with rigor is itself a form of advancement. Ultimately, the evidence suggests movement without explaining outcome. That is an uncomfortable position, but it is an honest one. It keeps the focus on what can be known and tested, rather than what can be imagined. In a case defined by absence, clarity about movement may be the most solid ground still available. The Summer Wells case offers a broader investigative lesson that extends beyond any single theory or outcome. Evidence does not exist to confirm narratives. Narratives exist to explain evidence. When the two conflict, it is the narrative that must yield. In this case, physical indicators scent behavior, environmental conditions, terrain, and movement patterns quietly resisted the earliest assumptions. Yet those indicators were never fully integrated into a revised framework. One lesson is the danger of anchoring too early. When investigators, media, or the public settle on an explanation, whether wandering, abduction, or accident, subsequent evidence is often interpreted only in relation to that anchor. Anomalies are minimized rather than examined. But anomalies are often where truth hides. Scent ending at a road, footprints climbing a ridge, or evidence appearing after rainfall are not details to smooth over. They are signals that the model may be wrong. Another lesson is the value of environmental forensics. Weather, terrain, and animal behavior are not subjective. Rain alters scent. Soil records time. Elevation changes behavior. These factors can narrow timelines and rule out possibilities with more precision than human memory ever can. Ignoring them expands uncertainty, using them reduces it. The case also highlights the importance of third-party evidence. Neighbors with no stake in outcomes, who simply report what occurred on their land, can provide critical corroboration. Their observations, especially when aligned with law enforcement actions, deserve careful preservation rather than dismissal. Finally, the most important lesson may be humility. Not every unanswered question implies wrongdoing, and not every unresolved case has a single dramatic explanation. Sometimes progress means acknowledging that investigators may have been looking in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ruling that out decisively is not failure, it is responsibility. In cases like this, truth advances not through certainty, but through disciplined doubt, patience, and the willingness to let evidence lead, even when it leads away from what we expected.